This is going to be the first video out of a series of videos that pertain more towards the beginner aspect of working with C++ and Unreal Engine. Now, you may have noticed I already have a beginner series with Unreal Engine, but that kind of more so pertains to networking and replication and all of that kind of stuff inside of Unreal Engine. This one's going to be a step farther back, more towards the people who have very little, or technically even people with no programming experience at all should be able to hopefully follow along with this series, as long as they have the general sense of logical thinking that would have to go into it. So I'm going to try to break this down and abstract as far as I can to really help give you an idea of what kind of things you should know, in my opinion, before diving into Unreal Engine. And this kind of goes with towards the same thing as if you're going to be working with Blueprint and C++ and Unreal Engine. However, Blueprint doesn't really have the intimidation factor there, since it's a visual scripting language that really kind of takes the intimidation away from what you would get if you were to dive in with, just purely intending on using C++. So what we're going to be trying to focus on in the first portion is unrelated to Unreal Engine. It's going to be completely outside of the engine, and we're going to be focusing on just C++ and covering the basic things that I think you should at least know before you dive into Unreal Engine. Now, a quick little list of things that we're going to be covering are variables, several different types, and I'm going to be comparing those, what we have in C++, to Unreal's C++, and then we're going to be covering some logic. So we're going to have our if-else statements, switches, all that kind of stuff. We're going to have our for while loops, for each, and all that kind of stuff. And as well as we're going to be covering enums, classes, structures, and most importantly, as you will be using these everywhere, pointers. So we're going to be starting from the very beginning, and that's what we're going to be doing in this actual video here. We're just going to kind of dive right on in and start covering variables. Now, I have not given any pre-planning into this, so I'm hoping I can just wing it and do a decent job. So before we do anything, let's go ahead and create our project. I've already got mine right here, but we go to File, New, Project, and I'm just going to select Console App for the language, C++, and just scroll down until you see Console App, hit Next, give it a name of whatever you want, and hit Create. And by default, you will have this with just a bunch of comments that you can ignore. So just get rid of them and set yourself up however you want. And then whenever you're ready, press Control F5, and you will have, hopefully, printed out Hello World to the console. So we're going to go ahead and, well, for now, we're just going to get rid of this. And we're going to start with variables. So the most simple one I can think of would be booleans. So to give you an example, we're going to do bool, and let's give it a name of B is on. And we're just going to set that to equal false by default. So what booleans are, they're commonly used to control states, just like I'll explain with enums, but booleans, they either have an off or an on. So 0 or 1, even though you can, for example, set it to anything greater than 1 and it'll be true, or if it's 0, for example, it'll be false, and that kind of thing. But it's generally just true or false. That's all you're going to get out of it. So if we come over here to an Unreal Engine project, like I said, I'm going to be doing some comparisons here, and we look at our weapon base. Inside of the weapon base, I have a boolean that I use for control, and it's called B can fire. So if we head over to the actual fire function, whatever, the function that we call whenever we go to shoot, which I will be covering functions, we have a check here. So if B can fire, meaning if we are allowed to fire. So if B can fire equals true, so B is on equals true, think of this as B can fire, then we are allowed to fire. We're allowed to shoot our weapon. But if we run out of ammo, B can fire is now going to be false, and we cannot fire our weapon. So that's how we use booleans kind of as controls. Well, at least that's what they're commonly used for. So they're either off or they're on. And you can kind of generalize what you would use them for just by kind of having those two states. So next up, we're going to be moving on to integers. So integers are just as if you were to take any math class, you would hear the term, but it's just numbers. And these are whole numbers. They do not have a decimal point. So for example, my integer equals, let's do 5. Well, we have our integer with a value of 5. So these can be whatever you want them to really be. And like I said, it's very, very simple. So for example, I use integers to store our ammo. So because, we can have an integer ranging from negative x to positive x, depending on your system and what type of integer. Hang on, let me find out where ammo is. Here we go. So that gives you a good idea of, a good way to just track what things you're at. So this can also be kind of used as controls. And really just any kind of thing you could think of that you would use a number for. So in my case, for this example, I'm using them for ammo. So I'm using int32, ignore the type, just think of it as an int. And I have current magazine ammo, current total ammo, and the max ammo that the weapon can have. So whenever we shoot, all we do is we take away from current magazine ammo until the magazine's empty. Once the magazine is empty, we reload, and that immediately goes to reducing the amount, the value inside of current total ammo. So it's used to keep track of the ammo in the magazine and the total ammo of the weapon in this case. So you could use these really however you want, but like I said, they are whole numbers, so you cannot have a decimal, for example, like 5.5, and have that work. If I were to print this out, let's see, my integer, and run it, you'll see it goes to, 5. I thought this would have rounded up. Does it not? Meh. So anyways, as you saw, it printed out 5. It didn't print out 5.8 or anything like that. But if you needed to have a value, a value that does have decimal points, such as 5.5, what we could do is we could switch to the type float. Now these are floating points. Let me change this to my float, and we'll print this out. So as you can see now, it printed out 5.5, and that allowed us to get just a decimal value for our variable. So if we needed that for whatever reason, such as in a lot of cases for things like, let's see, what would be a good example? Opacity and stuff like that. In some cases inside of Unreal Engine, you'll see a slider that goes between the range of 0 and 1. And a lot of values are like that for certain things, but it'll be like 0.1 or 0.001 or something like that, and it'll build its way all the way up to the value of 1.0. And you will commonly see this set up as 5.5f, indicating that it is a float. Now there is another type which you probably won't really use, but it's used to see it's double precision, so you can have a lot more trailing numbers. Here, I'll bring this up actually. Float versus double. And this will probably be able to give an example here. So a float has 32-bit precision, and a double, is it going to tell me? Unless I'm overlooking it. 32, so a double would have 64-bit precision. So it really just expands on it and gives you a lot more accuracy. So yeah, just pause it here if you want to do a quick read of what this is saying, because I'm going to try to be very brief as I stated earlier. So a double works in kind of the same fashion here. So let me change this to a double, and we can just run. It'll still be 5.5, but if we go ahead and do 5.5 and a bunch of trailing numbers, and go figure, when we print it out, it's going to round it off, I think. So I don't know how to exactly print it out without printing it to a file, but think of it like it's just going to have a more precise value. So for example, a double might have, I'm going to over exaggerate this amount, whereas a float might only be able to have an accuracy of, you know, this amount. So if you really need to have something that is very fine in its point of, such as like a very, very specific location, then you are going to want to probably use a double. But in most cases, I'd say nearly all of them, well, I can't say nearly all of them, but in most cases, floats are going to be just fine. You won't have to worry about it, because also doubles do take up more space in memory as well. So next up, we have a different type of number. So these integers, for example, integer range, let me just look it up. So an int has a value, let me find wherever it went, of negative 2,147,483,648 to a positive 2,147,483, sorry, 148, yeah, 47,483,647. It has a range between a big negative and a big positive. You also have unsigned integers, which kind of do the opposite. So for example, an unsigned int starts at 0. It does not have a negative value. It cannot. But it does go to a positive value of double the int. So that's why you'll see 0 to a bigger number, even though it is an int, compared to the normal integer. Now you also have these smaller ones. So for example, an unsigned char. Or in Unreal Engine's case, we have a couple different types, such as uint. We have an uint16, a uint32, uint64, and a uint8. And they all do the exact same thing. However, the difference between all of them is A, their range, and B, the amount of memory they're going to be taking up. So for example, we'll look at this unsigned char, which would be a uint8 in Unreal Engine's case. It takes up 1 byte. If we look up at a normal unsigned int, that takes up 4 bytes. And we can go even farther with an unsigned long taking up 8 bytes. And you can kind of see how this is going to keep going and going, but they take up different amounts of memory. So if you only need a value that has a range of 0 to 255 or less, you would want to use an unsigned char, or in Unreal Engine's case, a uint8. If you have a value that needs, from a negative value to a positive value that is relatively small, you could use a signed char or just a char, which would be negative 127 to positive 127, or in Unreal Engine's case, it would just be an int8. And that is essentially the case. So you can look up and see, I'm sure there's a page on Unreal Engine's website where they show all this kind of stuff, but that's how you can kind of take it and use it to however you need. So they each have their own purposes. Let's say we've done most things regarding just numbers, so let's move on to strings. So in C++, let me go ahead and include it. We're going to include string, and we're going to do std string my string, and let's just set it to hello again, and we can print out my string. So I'm going to print this out, prints out hello again. So a string is a series of characters. You can think of it like an array of characters. Now in C++, we'll be using std string. However, in Unreal Engine, as you can probably assume, they have their own types. So if we head over here, we have a couple different ones, and they all have their own purpose. However, I'm not entirely sure what the differences are. I'm trying to find an example of where I use strings. Here we go. So we have what's called an f string inside of Unreal Engine. So in this case, I'm using an f string to store the name of the weapon. So here on the wall, well, actually better yet, here we have, this is a weapon class, and it's got the weapon name of Colt 1911. So that is the value of this string called weapon name. Whereas I might have another weapon, such as the STG right here. Of course, that one has a, I didn't give it a name. Probably didn't give this one either. No, I did. This one has a value, or a string value, of M1 carbine. So they can use to pretty much store text. So if you're going to be writing to files or getting users' inputs, doing things with set input and all that, you're probably going to be using strings in some form. So if you're going to be, hey, what's your name, for example, like that, if you have an input box or stuff like that, you're going to be using std string in C++ most likely, or constant char pointers, or in Unreal Engine's case, most commonly you're going to be using fstring. Now there is another type, which I believe I used in the head, I did not, but they have types called fname, as well as text. So for example, fname, my name here. We also have another one, text, which is just a macro. So my text here. And they'll have their own actual uses. So for things like when you're working with sockets, you're commonly going to use fname, which I'll get into sockets later on. And when you're working with, I don't actually even know what the text macro exactly is. I think it's to keep something consistent between different types of systems or something, I don't know. I haven't looked much into it, but they do have their own types. Now, back on to C++. Let's see. We've done... So we also have characters, which you probably won't use, but just char. And let's do my char equals b. So if I print out my char, you can probably guess what it's going to be. It's just a single character. In my case, it prints out b. So I cannot have multiple characters going through this. It's going to not allow me at all. So a char is just for a single character. So if I wanted to, I could do new line and do backslash, whoops, backslash n. I'll put this in double quotes. You can kind of, oh, come on. There we go. Not let me do that. I thought it did. Anyhow, so ignore that little part. But we can also have variables for characters. And if you recall back from this list, a char is only 1 byte. So that can store more than just numbers. It can store letters and stuff like that too. And it can also have a range of numbers that you can use it with. It just takes up a very small amount in memory. So if we want to, we can get down to some very big values. So for example, if you need a extremely large positive value, you can use an unsigned long int. And that takes up 8 bytes in memory. And as you can see, I'm not even going to bother trying to read that off. It allows you to have a massive range. Now, on the other side, you also have a normal long int, which gives you a very large range, negative and positive. So you have a range for kind of each, pretty much everything you can come up with. So this might be a long int, whereas in Unreal Engine's case, this might be an int 64. 64-bit signed integer. Same thing. However, Unreal Engine, I don't know if there's any other stuff that they have going on. I'm sure there probably is to keep the range consistent across different systems, but you can assume it has a very large range. So you generally only want to use what you actually need. So because, let's say, I know my magazine is not going to exceed a value of 30, for example. Well, let's see here. I could use a char, unsigned char, signed char, or if I wanted to, I could even come down here and use an unsigned long int and have this huge range, but it would take up a lot more space in memory than I would want. So I would want to stick with the minimum. So if I'm only having a range of 30, I would just want to use an unsigned char because I know I'm not going to go negative and I know I'm not going to exceed 30. So I could use a uint8 and everything would work okay as intended, and it would have the smallest footprint in memory that you could possibly really use for this variable type. Whereas I'm currently using it in 32 because I'm going to have, I don't actually entirely know what the reason was, but I'm going to have larger amounts of ammo being stored in magazines that is going to exceed, for example, 255 and all that kind of stuff. I can't remember what my reasons were for choosing that, but in most cases, you would want to probably choose a uint8, and that would give you that range from 0 to 255, unless you're, doing some obscure weapon that holds a who knows how much, but anything above that range. So that is, for the most part, everything I can think of. Let's see what we did. Let me do a quick little run through in my head here. So we did booleans, integers, floats, doubles, unsigned integers. I gave a quick explanation. Strings. And for the most part, that's all I can think of that you'll actually really be needing to know, because that kind of covers it. So this was the first video, and it kind of exceeded went out a little bit longer than expected, but hopefully I gave a quick, decent overview of normal C++ types and Unreal Engine's types, because you are going to most likely be wanting to use Unreal Engine's types, but what they do and kind of ways that you can use them. I didn't want to go too in depth because I would make this video even longer than it already is, because I wanted this to only be about 15 minutes, but as you can assume, we're at the 20 mark. So hopefully this was useful in at least some way, because now we're going to actually dive in on some more fun things. So I'm not sure what we're going to be doing in the next video of this series, but trust, it will get more interesting, I can assure you that. So anyways, I will see you in the next one. Take care.